It all started with a simple decision to move my ranch mailbox 3 feet to the left. I didn't think it was a big deal. After all, it was still on my property, still along the main road, and definitely not bothering anyone. But in our neighborhood, we have one person who always finds a reason to stir the pot. You guessed it, Karen from the HOA. The moment she saw the new mailbox position, she stormed over like she owned the whole street, demanding I put it back immediately because it violated neighborhood aesthetics, whatever that means. At first, I tried to stay calm. I explained it was just a minor shift to make space for our new fencing project. But she wasn't having it. Instead of talking like a reasonable neighbor, she pulled out her phone and called the cops on me for moving my own mailbox. The whole thing felt surreal. 1 minute I was hammering a post. The next minute, a sheriff's deputy was at my gate, asking about a code violation complaint. Now, here's where things took a turn. When the officer reviewed the property lines and measurements, it turns out Karen may have more to worry about than a mailbox. Her own backyard fence has been crossing over onto my land for years, something I never bothered with before. Until now, her call to the police may have accidentally triggered something she didn't expect. A full-blown property line investigation and a potential lawsuit. What started as a petty HOA complaint over a mailbox might just turn into a legal battle she didn't see coming. And trust me, I've got the documents and surveyor reports to back it up. But that's not even the craziest part. You won't believe what she tried to do next when the surveyor marked the line. The day after the cops showed up, I decided to hire a licensed land surveyor just to be safe. I wasn't planning on starting a war, but I wanted things to be clear, especially now that Karen had involved the HOA and local authorities over something as minor as a mailbox. When the surveyor came out, he walked the property line with his equipment, double-checked the old plats and markers, and even pulled up some county records. That's when things got interesting. According to the official documents, Karen's fence, her fancy garden bed, and even a corner of her storage shed were sitting nearly 6 feet onto my land. I'll be honest, I was shocked. I lived here for years, and while I always had a rough idea of the boundaries, I never cared enough to make an issue out of it. But now that she'd made such a scene and dragged in the HOA board, I couldn't just ignore it. The surveyor flagged the encroachments with little orange stakes. And that's when Karen absolutely lost it. She came outside yelling, claiming the survey was fake, that the markers were tampered with, and that I was trying to steal her property. I stayed calm, told her she was welcome to hire her own surveyor. But she wasn't listening. A few hours later, she emailed the entire HOA accusing me of harassment and intentional sabotage. Then, she demanded an emergency meeting to discuss community integrity and started calling other neighbors to try to turn them against me. But here's where it gets even more bizarre. One of my neighbors, who's lived here longer than both of us, quietly pulled me aside and told me this isn't the first time Karen's tried to manipulate property lines. Apparently, a similar issue happened years ago on the opposite side of her lot. So now, I started wondering, was this really about a mailbox? Or has Karen been playing a much bigger game all along? As the orange survey markers stayed in the ground, the mood in the neighborhood started to shift. Karen wasn't just annoyed, she was on a mission. Within days, I noticed her walking around with a clipboard, stopping by other homes, chatting with neighbors, and taking notes like she was building a case against me. Some folks kept their distance, clearly uncomfortable, while others seemed unsure of what was really going on. The weird part, she even started measuring other people's yards, acting like she had some kind of authority. I wasn't the only one starting to feel targeted. Meanwhile, I was quietly collecting more information. I dug up old HOA documents, property maps, and board meeting notes. That's when I found something strange. There was no clear record of Karen ever getting official approval for that fence she built years ago. The more I looked into it, the more inconsistencies I found. Her backyard additions had somehow slipped through the cracks, and it looked like she'd been bending the rules all along while coming down hard on everyone else. For the tiniest things. It wasn't just me. Other neighbors started to speak up, too, telling me about times Karen gave them citations for having garden lights too bright or leaving out trash bins for an extra hour. One couple across the street mentioned how Karen once tried to fine them for installing a swing set, claiming it wasn't in harmony with community values. But now that she was under the spotlight, the double standards were becoming clearer. Still, that didn't stop her from pressing forward. She submitted a formal complaint to the HOA board accusing me of aggressive property behavior, whatever that means, and requested that I be fined until I restore the mailbox to its original position. At the same time, her own violations were piling up, but she acted like none of that mattered. The question now was, what would the board say when the full truth finally came to light? The week before the HOA board meeting, things got tense. Karen had doubled down. She printed flyers claiming I was disrupting the community, and even taped them to neighborhood mailboxes, including mine. Some neighbors rolled their eyes and tossed them, but a few started looking at me differently. That was the part that stung. I'd lived here peacefully for years, and now, because I moved my ranch mailbox a few feet and dared to challenge Karen's fence, I was suddenly being painted as a troublemaker. Behind the scenes, though, I was preparing. I gathered all the surveyor documents, photos of the boundary markers, and copies of past HOA approvals, hers and mine. I even got a few neighbors to write short statements about their own run-ins with Karen. It wasn't easy. Some were afraid to speak up. One neighbor admitted she didn't want to get involved because Karen once threatened to report her for a code violation just for letting her kids play chalk on the sidewalk. But slowly, more folks started to talk. Stories about Karen's long history of petty complaints and quiet overreach started connecting the dots. Then, the final twist came just 2 days before the board meeting. I got an envelope taped to my door. It was a cease and desist letter from Karen's lawyer, accusing me of defamation and trespassing. She claimed the surveyor had stepped onto her land and that my actions were a targeted campaign meant to her ass. At that point, it felt like the whole thing had spun out of control. A simple mailbox move had now escalated into legal threats, HOA drama, and neighborhood division. And still, the biggest moment was yet to come: the board meeting, where I'd have to stand face to face with Karen, lay out everything I had, and watch how the rest of the community responded. All eyes were going to be on us. What would happen next? The night of the HOA board meeting finally came. I walked into the clubhouse with a folder full of evidence, still feeling the weight of Karen's legal letter in my back pocket. The room was packed. Way more people than usual showed up. You could feel the tension in the air. Karen sat front and center, arms crossed, wearing that same smug look she always had when she thought she was winning. I was ready to lay out my case. But just before the meeting started, something unexpected happened. One of the board members, Alan, who usually kept to himself, stood up and asked if he could speak before the agenda began. Everyone turned to him, confused. He pulled out a thin binder and said, "I think we need to talk about more than just a mailbox tonight." Then he flipped it open and began reading a list of past complaints Karen had filed over the years. Dozens. Everything from fence colors to bird feeders to a kid's lemonade stand. The room fell silent as people realized how deep her pattern of behavior ran. But it didn't stop there. Alan had also found a conflict of interest buried in the HOA records Karen had quietly helped write, and approved the very mailbox placement rule she now claimed I violated. And she did it without disclosing that her cousin was one of the board members who helped pass it at the time. Gasps rippled through the room. Even Karen looked rattled for the first time. But just when it seemed like things couldn't get more intense, a man in the back stood up. I didn't recognize him, but he introduced himself as a retired land developer who used to own plots in our neighborhood. And what he said next changed everything. according to his original plans. The land behind Karen's fence where her garden and shed sit was never officially deeded to her lot. In fact, it was classified as common HOA property, which meant she hadn't just crossed my boundary. She may have built part of her backyard on land that doesn't legally belong to her at all. The room went dead silent as the retired developer pulled out copies of the original lot maps. He handed them to the board, and all eyes turned to Karen. She froze. Her confident posture crumbled in real time. The documents were clear her fence, garden, and shed were sitting on land that technically belonged to the HOA, not her, which meant she wasn't just trespassing on my property. She was in violation of HOA rules on an even bigger scale. And the irony? She'd spent years using those same rules to control everyone else. One of the board members leaned forward and asked Karen if she ever submitted a request to build on that area. She didn't answer. Someone else asked if she'd known it was common property all along. Still nothing. You could feel the pressure rising as the truth unfolded. The board voted right there to launch a full investigation and freeze any further complaints from Karen until it was resolved. The cease and desist she sent me, thrown out as intimidation. The mailbox complaint, dismissed completely. Just like that, the power she had held for years slipped out of her hands. But just when I thought it was finally over, the unexpected twist hit. Later that week, I got a visit from the same surveyor who originally marked my property line. He came back, clipboard in hand, and said there was something odd he'd overlooked the first time. A small strip of land barely a few feet wide on the far side of my ranch actually overlapped into another neighbor's lot. Not Karen's. Someone else entirely, apparently. The original property markers from decades ago were misaligned by a few feet. It wasn't a huge issue, but it meant I'd technically been unknowingly parking part of my trailer on someone else's land for years. After everything, after Karen's meltdown, the cops, the mailbox, the lawsuit threats, it turned out none of us had completely clean hands. The land had its own story, written long before any of us got here. After the surveyor's final update, I went straight to the neighbor whose land my trailer had overlapped. Luckily, he was understanding. We talked it through over coffee on his porch, laughed about the whole mess, and agreed to draft a simple easement so things were legally clear. It felt good to resolve something the right way, neighbor to neighbor, without drama or threats. That moment reminded me of what living in a community is supposed to feel like. As for Karen, the HOA board concluded their investigation a few weeks later. Her backyard encroachment on common property was undeniable. She was ordered to remove the shed and pull back her fence line, or face legal action from the HOA itself. Several neighbors who had been quiet before started attending meetings, sharing their own stories, and even proposing rule changes to prevent future abuse of power. It felt like the whole neighborhood had finally woken up. The mailbox? It stayed right where I moved it. The board officially dismissed her complaint, and not a single fine was issued against me. What started as a petty battle over 3 feet of space ended up shining a light on years of overreach and helped bring some much-needed fairness to our HOA. Looking back, the biggest takeaway wasn't about property lines or rules. It was about standing your ground when you know you're being treated unfairly. It was about how small actions, like moving a mailbox, can uncover much bigger truths. And most of all, it was about how communities work best when people listen, respect boundaries, both physical and personal, and are willing to face uncomfortable truths together. So yeah, this ranch mailbox drama turned into way more than I expected. But maybe that's exactly what needed to happen.